primary ignition.
I'm just not the hero type, clearly.
What a piece of junk.
Enterprise, this is the captain.
I got a bad feeling about this.
It's all part of the plan.
Engage.
Welcome back to Podcast 2 for 1. I'm your host, Donovan Thompson, with my co-host,
Daniel Wingfield.
Today's episode 220 of Podcast 2 for 1, youtube.com/@2for1 studios. Guys and gals, it's the best place to consume all the content. If you didn't know, listeners, and let's be honest, you probably did not, we are sponsored by Kapow Comics, located at 4047 East Hill Avenue in Sherwood, Arkansas. There they have comic books, collectibles, graphic novels, and of course, special guest appearances throughout the year.
Kapow.
Go Pow. And if you heard, listeners, we just had a third Kapow there, which means the doctor is back in the house, Dr. Bruce Hutchinson.
Hey, I'm glad to be back as always and super excited to talk about our movie for today.
Me too.
Indeed.
And our movie for today is Se7en, directed by David Fincher. It is perhaps one of my favorite films of all time. These two gentlemen definitely know, but my thesis film was heavily in, it's one of the quintessential serial killer films, right? And my thesis, I love that kind of stuff, period. And my thesis obviously took a lot from this. And every time I watch it now, I used a lot of that score for temp score as I was cutting. And so now it's like I had this weird like PTSD slash I start seeing my movie when I'm watching their movie because the score and like I know what the points of my movie are fixing to happen. So anyway, it's just a weird thing, but
That's great.
overall, I don't remember the first time I saw this movie. It was probably maybe the first time was right before grad school or during grad school, or undergrad, I mean. And we can get into like the narrative stuff to it all and maybe about the ending as well. But I think it's about as good as you get in making a movie, even with its faults. And this movie taught me one of my favorite terms that I use on a set or in pre-production, and the word is texture. And I think this movie is dripping with texture. And every time I go into a film, I think about this one in terms of just how can we everything from just even like the coats, there's like water droplets when they're inside, making sure stuff like that is happening, and just the paint chips and all these kind of things. It's just the city itself with its own character. And so I want to get into all that, but I'm super excited about it all. And I want to hear from Bruce. Bruce, what's your thoughts about this film?
Yeah, I mean, I love Se7en. I think it's one of probably the prototypical serial killer movie. I mean, there were so many that came out in the 90s, especially, and this was right in 1995, so it was right in the middle of the decade. But I think it really set the tone, and I don't think there's been a better serial killer movie since. And even now you see these movies like Long Legs, that are referencing Silence of the Lambs, I guess, which would be the other, I think, top-notch serial killer movie. And Se7en, and honestly, they don't really come close in my book to the comparison with those two. And then the other thing I'll just say is, and you mentioned this just a second ago, it's very easy to talk about the visual style of the movie, the production design, and just how incredible it is. But the movie has some pretty interesting narrative aspects to it as well in terms of its narrative structure, and maybe some surprises. I'll be curious to hear what you think and share my thoughts about the protagonist and the structure and some of the different things that happen there, especially because it's a movie that gives us, we get titles in this movie, right? We get day titles, and so that can always be really interesting because and this is a bizarre comparison, but probably the filmmaker who does that the most is Wes Anderson, who always has titles that tell you
For sure
something about the day or whatever. And those titles can be interesting because sometimes they are clues to the structure of the movie and sometimes they're not. For instance, in Wes Anderson's Grand Budapest Hotel, I think he has 3 or 4 titles in the first 30 minutes of the movie. So they're not really giving you much information about like an act structure or sequence structure, because they'll have one and then they'll have one 5 minutes later, and then they'll have one 35 minutes later. These are a little more interesting, and of course we've got 7 days over the movie Se7en, and so it'll be really interesting to talk through kind of how the structure is laid out and how the protagonists function. And I'll be super curious. You mentioned the ending, whether this movie has an optimistic or a pessimistic ending, because on one level it seems like it doesn't, but I think there's room for debate there. So yeah,
There is
I'm
too.
super excited about our conversation.
Real quick before you get in, Daniel, another movie we did, I think it was Halloween last year or 2 years ago, was The Ring, and it also
Yeah.
has title cards to tell you the day.
Oh yeah.
Interesting.
There you go. In that interesting parallel. All right, Daniel, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you guys, I couldn't say it much better than you guys just did. I mean, it's the quintessential serial killer horror movie for me too. I've watched it within the last year and then watched it again for this, and it's a movie where I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna kind of review because I've seen it semi recently, and then I'm just hooked right back in, and I can't look away, and it's gripping me, and I'm just like, I've seen all this, but I can't look away, and I just want to keep watching, everything that's happening. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very interested to dig into the structure with you guys as well. I do think I agree with you both about the last comment that I do think there is a lot of interesting things thematically going on in terms of like what the movie is saying, and what it appears to be saying versus maybe what it is saying. Of course, I love the whole element of the city as well, and it feels very much like a character itself in this film. I was also just, as an aside, I was struck by there's these little random bits of humor that happen, but they never are called attention. They're never spotlighted, but if you're paying attention, they're happening like right at the end of a shot or whatever it is. And I was just, I don't know, the layers to this film. It's like every time I watch it, I notice a different layer. You know what I mean? Like, and so yeah, I'm really excited to dig into it with you guys.
Yeah, I gotta say real quickly on two of the things you said. I felt the same way when I was watching the movie, like, and especially doing a structure breakdown. You get to the last act, and I know everything that's gonna happen. I'm like, I don't need to watch these last 20 minutes, but I can't help it.
Yeah, right.
Like I can't turn it off. Like I just have to keep going. And then to your point about the humor, the captain, played by Arlie Ermy, who's just known in the credits as police captain, I guess. That moment in terms of humor when they're sitting in the bullpen and the phone rings and he answers it and he says something, there's whatever, and then he hangs it up and he's like, "That isn't even my phone."
No, he says it to the phone. He says, "This isn't even my desk," and hangs it
in my
desk.
desk.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah,
it's great.
No,
I love the moment. Sorry,
Yeah.
the moment that cracked me up this time is when they're at Brad Pitt's house having dinner and they're reviewing the case afterwards, and like Brad Pitt gets him some wine. And then like the subway comes up and it's like he hasn't looked up yet, but he picks up the wine glass and it's like a normal glass and it's like
glass like this thing.
Yeah.
And he
All the way
like
to
looks
the
at it
top
like, what
with
the
wine.
fuck? And then it's never mentioned. Like it's never called back on. Like it's over and it's never. And it was just like, oh, that's amazing. Yeah. I love that again, you think of this. It's very dark. It's very grisly. It's very grungy.
Yeah.
I also was struck how very 90s it like even just the title sequence is so 90s in its style and in its presentation, but it was kind of surprising to find these moments of levity that I don't know, maybe just you don't maybe especially when you're kind of hooked into the thrill of it and you're trying to you're kind of along for the ride, then maybe they go unnoticed when you're just amidst all this kind of grisly murder and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was laughing last night too, and Kimley, when we first started dating 2 years ago, this is one of the first movies I had her watch, and she only got like 30 minutes in before she fell asleep. But last night, I was like, "We're gonna have to watch this. You're gonna watch the whole thing," and so we watched the whole thing, and I was taking notes the whole time. And when we got to the final act, I just closed my laptop because I just like I don't need to take notes anymore. I've seen it so many times and whatever. But I said the same thing to her. I was like, and I think the other competitor, which is also David Fincher, is Zodiac.
Yeah, I was
told her last night. I said when you turn on,
Yeah.
I said Zodiac's like an hour longer than this one. I said, but when you turn that on, I can't not watch it. And then when it gets done, I'm like, I need 3 more hours of this movie.
But they're completely different.
I need a
They're
sequel.
very different.
Yeah,
they're very different. But to your point about the comedy, yeah, Kimley was laughing a lot last night. I look over and she looked like she never does it. She was leaning forward, like watching the movie, and then you just see like she was just kind of disturbed by some of the images, but then I'd hear her chuckling about Brad Pitt doing something, like he's
Yeah.
very physical, like he would be like lay on the couch and he'd move like I guess the cigarette, canister or like the side table on like when they're in the hallway waiting for the
Mm.
fingerprint results, and like just his physical reactions of like this stuff he would do that, I'm not sure I'm not sure we're in the script or not, but it seems like they were just always adding little character moments. And also, again, I think
Yeah.
it is super important to undercut some of the craziness that is going on, and also it makes you more empathetic towards the characters. But yeah, let's kind of dive into it, guys.
Yeah.
Of course, we open this up with Morgan Freeman, and he's getting his coat on, those kind of things, um, and we're into an interesting part here, all the way to a crime scene, and we at Mills and Somerset meet each other for the first time, and you kind of see automatically. I think one of the things that the movie is trying to say about Morgan Freeman, or at least he's trying to say about himself, is that he doesn't care. And immediately, I think the first thing you see that he does care is like when he says, "Did the kid see it?" And the cop is like, "No,
Yeah.
like who cares?"
Mhm.
Whatever. And so it's automatically we're getting told, we're getting something about his character, which we're fixing to be told very shortly, that he doesn't care. It's why he's retiring, and he just wants to be done with the city. So, what's your guys' thoughts on this first? I mean, I guess a good way to point this is the first 4 minutes is to the credit sequence. It's kind of like a prologue versus a start of a sequence, probably. And yeah, we kind of get right into it. See our characters into the credit sequence, which does tell us a little bit about our world and villain. But yeah, what's your guys' thoughts so far?
Yeah, I agree with you. First of all, I'm curious, did you both think that Morgan Freeman's character, Somerset, is the protagonist of the movie?
I do, because
Mm.
it starts with him and it ends with his narration at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
ultimately,
I do think. I mean, I think it's hard for me to. I mean, there's a part of me that says, could it be Brad Pitt? Could it be his journey? Because he's the one that really changes a lot in some ways. Somerset maybe changes, to a degree, but he still feels like the same guy in the beginning and the end of the film to a degree as well. Maybe he's changed a decision or two, but he's still Somerset, and he still kind of holds the same to a degree.
well,
Value.
realizing who you are is, and not saying he does at the end, but realizing who you are is a huge change. I mean, that's a
You're
big
right. You're
change.
right. You're right. You're right.
Yeah, I do. I would argue he changes too. I mean, in the sense that something has kept him from caring or convincing himself that he doesn't care, and at the
Sure.
end, he is willing to admit that he does care. And it's funny that you mentioned that Brad Pitt changes, because he sort of does and he doesn't, in the sense that he has this gung-ho, we got to solve the crime kind of attitude, and he ends up seeing how horrible and dark the world can be, but we never really get to actually
Sure.
see that change, right? I mean, he shoots John Doe, and then he sort of disappears, right?
You can
But
definitely infer based
Yeah.
on our
yes,
world
yes,
And him
yes.
that
shooting John Doe. I mean, that is the decision that would theoretically push him over the edge. I mean,
But
he's
I don't know if that's a change in him or not. I mean, I guess
yeah,
we're talking about the ending from the start, but
yeah,
it's
yeah.
hard not to. It's hard not to.
it seems like that's something he might have done at the beginning of the movie too. I mean, he doesn't strike me as
Had these
someone
same things
like
happen. Sure.
that he's by the book, or that he's someone who wouldn't, take revenge if he needed to. I mean, we see partway through the movie when they get to John Doe's house that he doesn't care about getting a search warrant. He just kicks in the door. That doesn't mean he'd automatically shoot someone, but it becomes harder to tell.
Sure.
I think what's interesting and a little more subtle, though, is how often we're aligned with Somerset versus Mills.
Mhm.
As you said, we start with Somerset, we end with Somerset, but also, and this is really fascinating, and it's just a sort of projecting ahead, there are more scenes between Somerset and Tracy, just the two of them, than there are between Mills and Tracy, even though Mills and Tracy are married.
Mhm.
Somerset gets more scenes with her than Mills does, and I think that's another thing that really points to him being the protagonist of the movie. Uh, But yeah, I was just
And
curious what you thought about that, as we start.
and whenever we are in moments of cross-cutting when they're kind of doing their own separate investigations, we're seeing more of Somerset, and we're
Yeah.
using Mills as more of a visual touch point. Like Somerset's doing the work, and Mills is too, but Mills is kind of, well, obviously he's doing like books, the book notes, whatever, but you're seeing the actual visuals from him. So it's like really just cross-cutting to kind of to make the scene more interesting. But really Somerset's doing the work there.
And Somerset's driving the investigation. He's the one really figuring most of it out. Brad Pitt's contributing, noticing things, but I feel like it's Somerset that's connecting all the dots.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that too
Yeah.
is just, yeah.
But
Well,
go
maybe
ahead.
we are skipping ahead, but I do want to say something about Brad Pitt's character. There's this moment, and this I don't know how you guys feel about it or how it does repaint the ending or doesn't, but there's a moment when they're in the vehicle. I think it's like two-thirds in, and he's talking about the first time he shot
Yeah.
somebody,
Mm,
and he
yeah.
says he doesn't even remember the guy's name. And to me, it feels like it bothers him. He doesn't remember, but also it's
Yeah.
kind of like I don't know. So I think I don't know that we'll just keep that in mind as we get to the ending. But yeah,
Yeah.
let's talk about this opening. We can even go past the credits here. We can go into this first sequence, which is Monday, right?
Yeah.
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 I mean, obviously, right off the bat, the movie wants you to know what kind of movie you're in. I mean, you already mentioned with sort of the prologue and then the credits, but when we see the first murder scene, when we see the gluttony scene, and everything that plays out in that, obviously, we're getting a really great sense of what this movie is going to be and what it's going to look like. And then, like you said, we get Mills immediately showing up, and this is the first murder that he's sort of being assigned or co-assigned with Somerset. And I think the movie does a really nice job of creating that oil and water kind of relationship between the two of them, where Somerset just, he has no patience for this guy. And like you said earlier, maybe he seems like he doesn't care in the sense that he's lost emotional investment, but it's not just the kid, it's Mills talking to him and him saying, "Will you just shut up?" And then a minute later going, "Why don't you go canvass the neighborhood with the other cops?" He's like, he just doesn't want him there. Both because I think he doesn't trust him at this point, but also because Mills is getting in the way of him doing his job, and he'd rather just do the job alone than have the distraction of Mills sort of asking all these questions and dealing with this new partner he doesn't know how, what he's going to do or what he's going to touch or what's going to happen with him. So it's a super efficient, especially once we get past the credits. I mean, that opening murder and the introduction of Mills is incredibly efficient, and so many things are happening in that opening.
And theoretically, he does want to push Mills away because he wants to retire in 7 days. So, like, a partnership in the cop world, at least from what I understand from TV and movies, is like a sacred bond, right? And so,
Yeah.
Starting that bond, I mean, it's challenged already when she introduces him to dinner later. But like, I'm saying, so like, he doesn't want that bond as well. So he's like, that's probably another extra little layer there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, the first or so like we see the first body, right? And this one is gluttony, or no, greed, right? Or is
Gluttony.
it's gluttony?
It's
It's
but we don't
gluttony.
Gluttony's
know
the
it
first
yet.
one.
We don't know it yet.
We found out later it's gluttony. Yeah, I just want to talk about like how, again, just when you're going through all these scenes, I mean, just how incredible the production design is and the shot composition. I mean, David Fincher is especially he's my top five for a reason. I mean, he just absolutely knows how to frame a camera and then how to get I think amazing performances. There's a performance later we're gonna talk about that I'm like every time I see it, it blows my mind. But yeah, I just want to talk about it again, how great it is, and then how I think one of my favorite things about serial killers movies is like this. Maybe it's the sick, dark, twisted part of me is seeing the signature, right? So it's seeing how a corpse or how a victim is displayed, and then how that informs the mythology that the killer is operating in, right? So if the modus operandi is the why they're doing it, the signature is how they're doing it, like the repeatable patterns, the things that are making them whatever the the Hannibal the cannibal, right? He eats his victims until he becomes that's his moniker. And so anyway, this already setting up this very intricate game of mythology here, and I just think it's credible, and I love that stuff so much. So
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's the details that I think that there's like the detail. What's fun about this movie? It's kind of like unwrapped, like it's like an onion. Like it first appears this, and then you unwrap another, and like, oh, what we thought was that is now this other thing. And I think there's something really addictive about that kind of like. They're uncovering, almost a conspiracy. I mean, like he's been planning this for years and it's been in action for at least a year. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really fun because it just indicates the intelligence of the killer. You know what I mean? And that just kind of like, and I think, they really do a good job of making Morgan Freeman really intelligent or like Reed is really intelligent. So it's just this great, like, really smart cop, maybe the smartest cop they got versus, the smartest serial killer the city's maybe ever seen. You know what I mean? And I think it's great.
Yeah, and it is also interesting too that the setup of these two guys of being so different. I mean, there's so many things. I mean, not that the movie makes a big deal about race, but obviously we have a almost like back to Lethal Weapon. We've got
Right.
a black cop and a white cop, but Somerset is intellectual and detail oriented. Mills seems to go by his gut. He's more emotionally
Yeah.
sort of reactive to things. And even right at the beginning, when Mills discovers that the cops haven't moved the body sort of to check to see if he's still alive, and so he's sort of yelling at the cops, and then of course we get in there and we understand that the cops had a perfectly good reason for their conclusion.
Yeah.
So he's sort of insulting the local cops, and Somerset's annoyed with him for that. But then he's also like, what was the point of that questioning? Like, what did you think was going to happen by giving that cop a hard time about
Right.
checking whether he was still alive? Like that was pointless. You know what I mean? So already we're not just setting up the conflict, but we're setting up the two poles that each character is going to operate under, which of course is going to be a huge part of the payoff at the end of the movie, right?
there is this little interesting thing too. And this is like one of the more subtle thing. This is kind of goes back to our Die Hard conversation. This is more subtle than Die Hard, obviously, but there is obviously, they talk about like him talking to the cops, and then when the SWAT team come in, it's like they're calling them dicks, right? Which private investigators are known
Right.
as private dicks, but they're not. He's not saying it in the
Right.
he's not using it nice, right? It's just he's insulting them as he's trying to communicate to them, and there's also that little commentary there too of like talking to your fellow officers and like how that communication and how you operate the system can help you solve a case probably.
Yeah.
So there's little things in there. Again, it's not a huge thing. This is a really small thing that's throughout the movie.
Hmm.
But yeah, I do want to. So after we have that first crime scene, they get in the car and they start kind of getting to know each other a little bit, kind of asking each other some questions. And I think it's around minute 13 that we start getting the autopsy of the first body. We learn that he died by eating. We learn that he got the gun pressed to his head. And we kind of officially get the sense that it's a homicide, right?
And then it's like fucked up. Like he like got force fed and then he like passed out and then he kicked him and then that like exploded his gut inside.
Right.
And that's,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
it's like the level where you realize that like, oh, this
Yeah.
was like very intentional.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah. It's great. It's a great moment. Also, I just love the actor that plays the coroner. He has a big part in The Wire in the later seasons, but I love seeing him again.
Yeah.
He's got a great voice.
He's a good actor
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
And if I missed, yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say if I missed anything, we can kind of go to minute 14. That we get more autopsy info with the captain. And I think we're at the bullpen now, right? Or not bullpen, but we're in the captain's office, I think.
We're in the captain's office, and
Yeah.
this scene to me is really interesting and key because it goes off in a direction which you don't think it's going to do, but it's actually really efficient from a narrative point of view, which is that the two officers split up, right?
Right.
So Morgan Freeman, Somerset just wants to quit entirely, but the captain won't let him do it. So he is assigned to the gluttony case. But he also Captain listens to Somerset and takes Mills off of that case. It's like, okay, fine, I'm not going to put you on that case. And then assigns, we don't find out right away, but Mills gets assigned to the next case, which of course is the greed case. And so it's a really nice way where they sort of get split off for the rest of the act and they're each doing their own thing. And then at the act climax, in a sense, they're going to come back together when Somerset realizes that, these crimes are part of the same,
The classic, your case is my case. That's what that is.
Yeah.
It's interesting too, because this is kind of the moment where our protagonist, where Somerset kind of tries to resist, I guess, deny the call, right? Like, I guess, I mean, the inciting incident, I guess, is the gluttony murder, them finding it. That's what sets it off. And then this is the moment where he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But he doesn't get a choice. And so he's like this, he's the reluctant hero. He's the one that is being forced into the situation, doesn't really believe he's going to be there to finish the job. That's his main argument. This is going to go way past me. You know what I mean?
Well, and he even says before the gluttony case is found, like, he already knows this is a serial killer. He's like, this thing is way too plotted and careful, and like, this isn't random. Like, we're going to get more of these, and no one listens to him until Mills gets assigned the gluttony case, and then we get the information. What's really interesting though is that even then, like, even after, when they're in the bullpen and they're sort of comparing notes, they still don't quite come together, right? They still sort of go off on their own, because we sort of get this, the climax is pretty early, which is when they're in the bullpen. I think it's around the 25-minute mark, where Somerset is like, there's going to be 5 more murders, right? And he tells them about the 7 deadly sins. But I think before the act ends, like, I would say the climax is that moment, but then we have this whole montage, which to me is still like an extended ending to Act 1, where they're each doing their separate research, right? And this is where Somerset goes to the library and he gets all of the information, and then he basically photocopies it and he leaves it for Mills.
This sequence was like directly in Chronos. I feel like he's flipping the page to these like Greek gods, or like
literally when it was happening, I said, I literally last night to Kim, I said, you see right here, you see a little bit of Chronos here, is what I told her. But I had the same thing in my notes, Bruce. I put at minute 23, your case is my case, like that revelation. But then I was kind of like, wait a minute, and I put minute 30, probably the beginning of Act 2, where after the library thing. I do want to back up just a smidge real quick. And I want to say something about the scene where we're in the captain's office. For me, not every time, but a good chunk of the time when I'm blocking a scene, I will go back and watch this particular scene, because it's especially between 3 different people, because the way the camera moves and who's talking and who's listening and what the camera's cutting to, that scene particularly is a master class in terms of blocking, camera placement, and just how the camera is enforcing the story. And I just want our listeners to know that, like, it's a perfect scene for a 3-person talking.
It might have been you, but honestly, I kind of feel like it might not have been. But there was a time in my directing class where I used to make people bring in a scene and talk about how it was framed and cut, and someone did that scene. Weirdly, I don't think it was you.
I don't think it was me. I don't think it was
but
me.
it just like points to that even more, that like I had assumed, like, it might have been Jason Miller, actually, who you guys know.
That makes sense.
He's great.
But I could be wrong about that, who like brought that scene in as sort of like an ideally staged and cut scene. Yeah,
it's perfect. It's a perfect scene. But yeah, I mean, we don't have to gloss over too much, or talk about too much, but minute 17 is where Tuesday kicks in. And we get what's interesting too is that the press conference there, I thought initially, even watching it last night, that's the press conference for this first body. Like, after that, maybe they have told it's a homicide, right. The press. But what's great about it, it's the press conference for this new body that we have.
Right, because he's a famous attorney.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that was, I think it's a great little kind of way to get you already into the action. Because there could have been the scene where they get a phone call, there's another body, but instead we're kind of skipping all that, and it almost acts as a press conference for the first body as well, in a weird, in a weird way, how you
Yeah.
die information. So anyway, I think that's pretty great.
Yeah.
And also, well, I was saying, it also puts a small timer or just more pressure on the cops of like, there's with that swift justice right now, the world is kind of watching, or at least the city's watching. So.
Yeah, it is interesting too, because it initially sets up a pattern which it doesn't really hold to, which is that there's a crime on Monday and then there's a second crime on Tuesday. That pattern won't quite hold up the rest of the way. But it is interesting that initially it sort of lulls you into that thought of a crime a day. Obviously, once we get into Act 2 and Act 3, we can see where there was crimes and what days crimes are committed and what days crimes aren't committed. But yeah, it is interesting the way that gets set up initially.
And I love how it mirror. I mean, I love, it's like, I think it's before the credit sequence, or it might be right after, like Morgan Freeman, right at the beginning, says, "I only got 7 more days." And it just, it starts the themes like before we've seen a murder, before any of that stuff. But yeah, I know, I agree. I think again, this is like, upping the stakes. And I think the greed murder scene is maybe one of my favorites. I don't know. I mean, I just think it's, for one, I think it just is interesting that he's targeting this higher class person, and the way he like displays him, and the way he does the wife picture and all that stuff, which I also this time, and I wonder if you did, to me, I don't know if it's actual foreshadowing by the serial killer, but the fact that we cut from, I think it's either a picture of the wife, of the lawyer's wife, or the painting to Gwyneth Paltrow, like in bed. I was like, okay, this is like it felt foreshadowing of her being targeted. And obviously, I don't think the killer that wasn't the killer yet. I don't think he could have had that as a part of his plan.
It's just the movie.
But it felt like, and honestly, they look kind of similar. Like in the movie, they're like, petite blonde women with like shoulder length hair. They kind of had a similar look. Anyway, it was just, I just picked up on that. I was like, and again, it's like, because I know the ending, is that the only reason that could potentially be there? But anyway.
One little thing I want to add real quick is that this is the, we're only 17 minutes in, but this crime scene is the first time that they know the killer is talking to them. Right. And so, I think based on the finding like the I guess the painting, whatever, and like who the next target's going to be, but he discovers that it's gluttony. Well, it's because it says gluttony. Is it gluttony is written on the floor? Is that what it is?
Greed is written on the floor in blood.
Greed. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry, my notes are messed up here. So greed. So this is the first time they actually.
And then that sends Somerset back to the
exactly which is great, because again, it's it's always fun whenever you're revisiting scenes and finding new information, and that information gets you to unlock the next level, so to speak. So anyway, I think
and I loved how it happened too. Like it's not really the greed being on the floor isn't the thing that actually pushes him over the edge. He's like sitting there, and his captain's like, "Hey, they found this stuff, and this was also in the gluttony guy's stomach, these like little strips of plastic or whatever he says it is," and that's what makes him go back, and that's what makes him notice the scrapes in the floor to pull back the fridge. It's just, I don't know, there's a great sense of just domino cause and effect going throughout the movie, and I really liked that moment of it.
It is kind of also a little, man, I'm going to reference every movie we've ever talked about on this thing. It's also a little Dark Knight, where it's like, how many detectives, including this one, would have thought to pull the refrigerator, what I'm saying? Like refrigerator out, and like it just, you had to, right? To get kind of some of the next puzzle pieces. So it's a movie where it is determined on everything perfectly matching up to the killer's advantage, for sure.
And I have a question about that later that I didn't notice before, but I want to save that towards the end. So.
Yeah, I will say, I think it's, also what a great excuse to have the music playing as they're going through he's going through the library.
Yeah.
I like that. Yeah, I like
and
the interaction
also,
he has with all of them.
Yeah.
and last thing I'll say about this sequence, personal thing, is that every time I see this, I tell Kimberly, I'm going to have one of those lamps somewhere in my office someday. Those green lamps. I'm
Yes.
obsessed with these green library lamps. I have all every time a court movie or anything like that, I'm like, I've got to get one of those fucking lamps.
We
So
used to
anyway,
we used to have those, I think, at UCA, by the
I love them.
way.
It
I
used to
love
be.
them. They're
It used to be like the standard office desk like
Yeah.
lamp. That was just
Yeah.
like
well,
the
I think
desk
it's
lamp
because the
everybody had.
green
Yeah.
doesn't is
Yeah.
not supposed to hurt your eyes as much or something like that. So
Yeah, I don't
Huh.
know.
that was the
Um,
theory behind it
Okay.
originally. But anyway, your case is my case, minute 23. We get Paradise Lost. We get the seven deadly sins. It goes elaborate minute 25. Somerset can't turn it off, even though it's like he's basically packaging it up for Mills. He just, it's a nighttime, he's by himself. What
right.
else are you gonna do with your time, right? And so minute 30 is Wednesday, and I put that as the beginning of Act Two.
I agree with that. And I think one of the interesting things about this movie is the way in which the climaxes happen and then the beginnings of next acts happen, because even though later on some of the climaxes will be like a murder, the climaxes really in the end aren't, or I should say the murders aren't really climaxes because we know that they're coming. So they're almost always intertwined with something else, which we'll see later. But it is really interesting that like this is a movie that could have really obvious act climaxes, some big moment, and then it immediately becomes obvious what the next goal is. But this movie is much more subtle with that, and the way it moves between each act, I think, I mean, like I said, for me, the climax is around 24 and a half when Somerset explains that there's going to be 5 more murders, but we get 5 more minutes of the act, which is a montage, which is the weirdest. I don't think I've ever seen an act just end with a montage, especially a montage of researching at the library, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's as slow kind of an end to an act as you could have, and they're still split off, right? At the end of Act One, going into Act Two, they're still sort of working separately. That Somerset doesn't want to work with Mills. He just gives him his homework, so to speak. And then what becomes really interesting is that the Act Two goal doesn't really happen until Tracy brings them together, right? Because if their Act One goal is to sort of each work their cases separately, then the Act Two goal is that they're going to work the case together. But that doesn't happen until 4 or 5 minutes into, they go the next morning. We see Mills getting the cliff notes from the cop of all the notes that Somerset has left him. Then they have the awkward moment in the office. And again, talking about more humor, right? Tracy calls, Mills answers, then she wants to talk to Somerset. And there's that great moment. I'm curious what you guys think, where you can't hear what Tracy's saying. She invites him to dinner, and he's like, "Oh, I don't really think that'd be a great idea." And then she says something, and then he says, "Well, in that case, I'd be honored to come."
Yeah.
And I've always wondered, like, one line, what did she say to change his mind, to get him to show up?
The writers know it. The writers wrote it out. And,
I always imagined, even last night, I always imagined it was like no, you're coming because blah, blah, blah. Like it was more like a very stern, assertive kind of line. And he was kind of like, I'm not going to, like
yes,
it was
ma'am.
a classical yes, ma'am was what it was.
Well, that she could charm him into coming for sure, right?
For sure.
I mean, obviously, and once he meets her, I don't want to say he's smitten, but obviously
they have a connection. They have, I do love, the moment of the phone call, because he hands it back to Brad Pitt and he's like, hello, and she's already hung up. It's foreshadowing the fact that like Morgan Freeman and Gwyneth Paltrow are going to be much more of like on the same page than Brad Pitt. It's it's a great little foreshadow of that. And I agree. It's like the moment they walk in, you can tell. And they even have a shot where Brad Pitt might be noticing it just a little bit too, of just like, and through the dinner scene, it's just like they're kind of kindred spirits, you might say. Like they kind of see things similarly, even if Morgan Freeman is kind of more of this older, more pessimistic version of who Gwyneth might be. But and I think that's a really interesting, just it's an interesting element to the movie that almost feels a little random, I guess, in that like, wow, why would we have, these three pair and have, Morgan's character have that,
Well, I
it's
think
It's smart too. It's
it
smart.
is very smart. It's
Well,
incredibly smart.
I think it works thematically because Tracy hates the city. Like,
Right.
she's like all she can see is everything bad about the city. Mills doesn't seem to have that ability, but Somerset does too, which is really, I think, why he kind of acts like he wants to quit and why he sort of acts like he doesn't care is because the city is just, filled with awfulness and evil. And so the fact that she's met someone who sees the city the same way that
Right.
she does and maybe sort of has the empathy to understand that, is something that she picks up on, I think, pretty quickly from him and is part of, what, of course, that they meet again later, which we'll talk about, but why they have that connection. Obviously, I think that's super important thematically to what all three characters are going through in this pretty hellhole-ish kind of city.
Well, and it's so
But
brilliant because it changed. I mean, like, there's a version of this movie where everything's the same, but that relationship isn't quite there. And like the end of the movie is still horrifying, and like Brad Pitt reacts the same, but it changes the stakes for Morgan Freeman's character. Like how he's reacting at the end of that final scene means so much more because he obviously cared for her. You know what I mean? And had that relationship with her. And I just think it's just kind of I don't know. I agree. It's like it feels almost left field at first, but then it's undeniably a brilliant
well,
movie.
it's smart because automatically Brad Pitt and Gwyneth Paltrow are young. They're married. They're moving to a new place, which signifies typically optimism, typically. And then also she's pregnant, and so like we already know like. And they don't have a bad relationship. You know what I'm saying? They might be
Yeah.
disagreeing about their situation, or at least I don't think Brad Pitt disagrees. I think he's just kind of ignoring it or trying to make the best out of a bad situation. But it's smart because we should already think as an audience member that these two are good. And so we don't need that legwork. And also they help us writing wise too, because one of the first things she says to Somerset is, I knew I wanted to marry him the first time I ever saw him or
Yeah.
talk to him,
Or
which
dated or
automatically
whatever,
makes
yeah.
you,
Well,
which paints that
yeah.
relationship. And then that means you don't have to work on that relationship anymore. And you just you
Yeah.
focus on these other two,
Yeah.
and it saves time on a script level.
Well,
Um,
and she becomes the bridge, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you get Somerset and Mills together to be
Yeah.
buddy cops, right? And Tracy is the person who makes that happen, right? She's the
Yeah.
one who brings them together because she has obviously, like you said, she kind of vouches for Mills, and then she like immediately has a rapport with Somerset, and I think that's what brings that dinner together, and what
Yeah.
allows Mills and Somerset then to kind of keep talking after dinner and start working on the case. I should also point out another kind of funny, but in a different way, sort of moment is the dogs.
what a goofy thing to do when
Yeah.
someone comes to your house and start laying on the floor and playing with dogs. Every
Yeah.
time I think, I'm like, what?
And he's got
Like, what's
three
going on?
giant dogs, and
They calls them
floor
the
is covered
kids.
with newspapers because they're not getting walked, which actually tells us something about the city as well, and about like, so is Tracy supposed to walk these three giant dogs? Now he
By
does
herself.
say, like, he does end the dinner by
Yeah.
saying, "I gotta walk the dogs."
Yeah.
It's still like just the whole thing, and in a way, it's sort of endearing because Mills is just like, in some ways, like still a big dumb kid, who just goes and wrestles with these dogs, and hasn't thought through the idea of like, oh yeah, we're gonna move to the city with these three giant dogs, and somehow that's gonna work.
There's also this great line of like, I think from John Doe at the end, he's like, that wasn't me, about hurting the dog, right?
Yes,
And then,
yes, it was,
yeah.
yeah.
So there's also a little thing there too. Yeah, well, but we didn't really state it, but can we state the Act One goals and whether we accomplished it or not before we get into Act Two? I think it's pretty simple for the most part. Um, it's, hey, we got to figure out who's doing these killings, right? I mean, we gotta
yeah,
figure that out.
it's the movie. I mean, it kind of becomes just like the movie level goal.
Yeah, I would
Yeah,
say that's
yeah,
the movie level
yeah.
goal.
Right.
I
But
put for the act goal is just to work their cases separately.
for the first
Because
act,
we don't really know, and obviously they don't solve the cases by the end of the act, you know. So if we were to say for each act, oh, it was to solve the next case, you know, no goal would be resolved because until the very end
Yeah.
of the movie. So for
Yeah.
me, the act one goal is to work their cases separately, and then the act two goal is to try to solve the crime together, to work together
yes,
to solve the crime. And act two is interesting. I mean, we'll go obviously through the pieces of it, but you know, the act two climax is basically when they discover the third victim, Sloth.
Yeah.
But it's not, the climax isn't that they found another victim. The climax is they think that they found the murderer, right? Because they have the fingerprints, which they got from which crime scene? Now I've forgotten.
They got
Well,
they got those. Well, they got from the
Are you, but
painting.
this is well, it doesn't. They figure it out because he's looking at people that checked out the books, right?
No, this is
No, that
they
Oh,
happens
you're
go
talking
later.
about how we
they
get
go
to
back
Sloth.
to
You're talking about how we
they go
get to
back to
Sloth.
the
Yeah,
body
exactly.
crime
Yes,
scene
yes,
and
yes,
find
yes.
the fingerprints.
They find the
on
fingerprints.
painting.
They think it's the
Yeah.
murderer, but
Yeah,
then
so
as
where do
soon
they
as-
find the fingerprints? I just
behind the
can't
painting?
Minute
that-
41.
Behind there's a painting that they move, and then they have to dust it for prints.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So
We're
they,
just
they
collecting
take the painting
clues.
down.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
they talk to the wife. They find out the painting's upside down. They can't figure out what's going on. And then, Somerset figures out to dust for prints. So they're hopeful, you know, and of course, Somerset probably knows better, but they're hopeful that the prints will lead them to the killer, right? So they get a match. They go to the house. And instead of finding the killer, they find the third victim, right? So the climax in a way is not so much the murder, it's that they didn't find the killer. They thought they were hoping to solve the crime, and they didn't, right? They didn't get the person yet.
Yeah. What do you think about? I mean, the fact that he's still alive. That there is there an argument that like, I mean, the climax is that they don't find him, they find him instead, I guess. But like that, there is that moment that like also, I guess, you know, in some ways it spurs the next act. But I guess the idea is that like, you know, there's a lot of hope in that, right? That a victim that has apparently seen this killer a bunch is alive. To me, I'm automatic like as a, you know, as a detective viewer, it's like, oh, that should be a good thing, right? That
Except for then they go to the hospital and the doctor's like,
right.
his brain is mush. There's no way he's ever going to.
Yeah, right. No, it's temporary, obviously, but I guess it's like they're obviously the movie goal is find the killer. They think they're finding the killer here. They think, you know, they don't find the killer, but then they think they find a lead, but then that fails immediately as well. Anyway, I just wanted to there's a great moment of humor as well with Brad Pitt when they're dusting for fingerprints. He's like the killer, he's fucking with us, and he like bends over the desk. He's like, look at me, you see me? This is us.
Yeah.
And then it just cuts right away, and it's like,
it is hilarious.
you know, I also. Sorry, one more thing I just wanted to throw out is talking about Gwyneth Paltrow and their, you know, the moment that we had that connection with her and Morgan Freeman. What also happens after that, yes, they start working together, but like Morgan Freeman, like his interest and like commitment to the case like triples, it feels like, right? Like he's not just going, it does, like before this it feels like he's a little bit going through the motions. Like yes, he can't help be a detective, he's figuring stuff out, but it's like this is when he starts like, you know, talking with Brad Pitt about theories and kind of like just, it feels like he's getting invested in it. And I think for me, it's like, it's clear that it's like, well, it kind of harkens back to that conversation. He's like, why didn't you ever get married? You know, it just didn't work out. Like he didn't really have anyone to protect or care for in the city. And then as soon as he makes a connection with someone that he feels is could be a vulnerable person, you know what I mean? It's like now he's motivated to find this killer. I just think that's an interesting element as well.
Yeah, I do wonder if he never met her, I kind of still feel like he may have still proceed because just based on, again, he's lying to himself in the whole movie, you know, in a lot of ways.
Sure.
Like he does care, even based on the very first thing he says about the where's, you know, did the kid see it? One fun fact I want to point out, and I told you guys in our podcast about the French Connection. I'm going to work on every one this podcast. That it's important
Sorry, I
to
gotta
look
take a
at.
quick break.
It's okay. It's important to look at really important or look at past movies to kind of get inspiration. And I mentioned that the Russo brothers, when they were making Captain America: Winter Soldier and um, Civil War, that they were they mentioned the work. They mentioned David Fincher's work and particularly
Right.
his blocking. But what's
Yeah.
fascinating, and I never read this, but I've made this connection. Whenever they walk into Mills's apartment with Gwyneth Paltrow, the song "Trouble Man" is playing, and that song is a huge motif in Captain America: The Winter Soldier.
Interesting.
Um, so just another little connection there for you.
Yeah, one thing I did wonder about since you mentioned the music, is that the movie is very jazz oriented.
It is,
And
which
it's
I
and
love.
it's interesting because Brad Pitt's playing, they're playing jazz at their house. Like they don't seem
Hmm.
like a couple that would listen to jazz. I mean, if we're going to
No,
be stereotypical about it, Somerset being African American and being older seems the more likely person to be interested in jazz. And maybe that's another subtle connection that they end up having. But yeah, the fact that Mills and Tracy also listen to jazz is kind of interesting. I don't know how to feel about the fact that that's the primary recognizable music in the movie is jazz. Um,
yeah. Well, it's
uh,
also, I mean, they worked in, obviously we had, I think it was Howard Shore did the score for this, or maybe it was James Horner. I can't remember.
it was Howard
Um,
Shore.
okay, Howard Shore,
Yeah,
incredible, by the way. He's the best, one of the best.
yeah,
But I mentioned it, I don't think I finished my thought earlier, whenever he's going into the library and they use the poker game to motivate the classical music, which also,
right.
I'm not sure that they would be listening to classical music, maybe not, especially, but I think it's beautiful and I love
Yeah,
its
Well, and it
motivation.
also kind of feels like a rebuttal, right? Because he's kind of
right.
criticizing him. He's like,
Yeah,
you spend the night in like this world of literature and knowledge, and all you do is play poker. Like, not much, it makes a reference to culture, and he's like, here's some culture for you. And so
Right.
I wonder if it was
yeah.
almost just like, I don't think that'd be the stuff they'd really listen to, but he's kind of jabbing him a little bit or something
Well,
like that.
it's a brilliant way on a script level, and also just to give texture to the scene
Yeah,
to play classical music.
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I think it's great. It's a great way to motivate that.
Uh,
Yeah. So again, we get to body two crime scene. We get the fingerprints of help me, and then we have this moment where basically Somerset tells him like what our job is, and we're just collecting clues,
Yeah.
right? We're just people who are getting the pieces together and going through hell doing it in hopes that there may be a positive outcome. But from the way he tells it is that most of the time there will not be a positive
yeah.
outcome. That's the
Well,
game.
I know he said that like the Act Two goal is like, they think they're going to find the killer, right? And like that they fail at that. But Somerset, I don't think he ever believes they're about to walk in on the killer. Like very early on, it's like the police are all like, "Let's go," and he's like, and Brad Pitt asks him, he's like, "You don't really think this is him, do you?" And he's like, No, it doesn't seem like his MO or whatever." And so there, I don't know, maybe there's an argument to be made that, um, I don't know, it maybe Somerset's goal more is just to advance the case or find the next lead, maybe perhaps.
Well, it could be,
Um,
and I think sometimes too, sometimes act goals are kind of either forced upon characters or
right.
they're, in this case, it almost feels like an institutional goal that Somerset just
Yes.
sort of has to go along with because all the other police and the captain feel like, oh, this is the big break. We're going to catch him. And so we just sort of get that put on us almost as the goal, even though, Somerset is smart enough to know that's probably not going to happen. Yeah. Um, Another thing I want to point out about Act Two, and this gets back to how the days unfold and where there's crime. So Act Two is Wednesday and Thursday. Um, and I think what's really interesting, and we'll see this in Act Three too, is that Wednesday there's no crime. So no crime gets committed on Wednesday, or we don't see a new crime discovered on Wednesday. Obviously, we don't always know exactly when the crimes were committed, but Wednesday is also the day that that they have dinner with Tracy.
Mhm.
And what's going to be interesting is that in Act Three, we're going to have a similar pattern where we're going to have Friday and Saturday as the 2 days. there's no crime on Friday, there is a crime on Saturday, and on Friday there is a scene with Tracy. So it's sort of interesting that the 2 days in Acts 2 and Act 3 that have a heavy scene with Tracy, there's no crime. And then the following day we get the crime. So with Act 2, they meet with Tracy, but they're also doing some of these other things. They're following up on the fingerprints and all that kind of stuff. And then we go into Thursday, and then we get the sloth crime that sort of culminates Act 2. And then at the end of Act 2, basically, sort of after the climax, Tracy calls Somerset, right? So it's sort of the end of Thursday, and if I remember correctly, Somerset's at home, and Tracy calls him at home and says that she wants to talk to him because she doesn't have anyone to talk to, and he sort of is non-committal, but she says, "Call me if you're available." And then we go to Friday, beginning of Act 3, and immediately, the very first scene is them having breakfast together.
Yeah, and I like that they, you can see his. It is weird. It's weird that she's calling him to talk, talk already, and
Yeah.
it makes sense. And
Nope, we just lost.
We just lost.
You lost your audio
You cut
for
out there
just
for
a
just a second. You're back though.
You're back, but yeah.
Cool. Okay. But I was saying, I think it's, it's just little subtle things of like the script writing and the performances that really kind of just set up the realism of the world for sure. Little thing is, and I never, obviously, I was going to ask you, Bruce, the first time you ever saw this, whenever John Doe makes his first appearance taking the photo of them, when you first watched it, did you ever notice that, or is that something that you didn't catch, or?
Man, I don't remember. I think the first time I probably didn't sort of catch that it was him.
I asked because at the time it was, Kevin Spacey was relatively new at the time when it was come out, and I think he had done The Usual Suspects beforehand. And I can't remember everything he'd done, but it was very much. He was also recast last second, and so I just didn't know based on that time period when it came out if people had caught it then or not. So I was just kind of curious about it. Because when I hear it now, you hear it's Kevin Spacey with like doing like an accent or something,
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So we're at the breakfast. I mean, we didn't really talk about the
Sloth murder too much. Yeah.
We can't remember. Well, we can't remember the guy's name in the car. But I think that does come a little bit to the end later. But we can revisit that later. Yeah, we didn't talk about Sloth too much. I mean, again, it's this is I can't remember what the crime scene was of Sloth.
It's
just laying in
like
his bed.
dilapidated house. Then there's that room with all the
The air
car
fresheners.
fresheners.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is cool.
Yeah.
I love that moment, and it's like just such a like
right.
you as soon as you see those, you know why they're there. You know what I mean? Before we see the body,
yeah.
we know exactly why those air fresheners are hanging everywhere.
And since we're getting more specific to the scene, just to your point, Daniel, about whether they're sort of an act goal or not. Remember, the SWAT team does come with them, right? Like, it's the whole
for
SWAT
sure.
team that clears out the place before they discover the body. And so, yeah, again, I think there's very much this institutional belief that they're going to find.
Sure.
the
And
killer there.
Somerset and Mills represent the police to a large degree. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're rooting for Somerset in a way that we're rooting for the police to figure it out and catch the guy. So
Yeah.
I agree. It totally makes sense. I just think I like though that that Somerset is still kind of, he continues to be kind of a one step ahead, at least of the cops, in terms of what's really going on here. So.
Yeah.
And I like that line a lot too, where he's like, they love this. Like, it's just another commentary on.
Well, and then
like,
they call
this
them.
is the place you're in. Is it a place where these people they love this kind of work?
Well,
which
and
I
they
don't think
call
is
them
a
detectives
great thing.
dicks, right? Isn't that what they call
That's
it?
what I was
And like
saying,
multiple
private
times.
dicks, Yeah. So yeah, you're right, Bruce. Minute 58 is we're starting with Friday, breakfast with Tracy, and here she reveals that she's pregnant, and Somerset reveals that he had an abortion, and this is kind of a thing that kind of mirrors the end here. This statement where he's like, where it's kind of maybe not contradictory, but kind of where he's like, I don't regret doing it, but every day I wish I hadn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and that gets straight to all of the complexity and everything with his character.
Yeah.
I also think it's pretty interesting that he admits that he pressured this woman and just
Yeah.
wore her down into, and I think we're supposed to understand that that's not like that's a confession from him. He
Yeah.
doesn't think he did something good. He understands he did something bad, but he also thinks,
It was
like you said,
necessary.
that it
Yeah.
was necessary, right?
Yeah.
That he had to do it, and yet he still regrets it. So that's I love the
Yeah.
complexity of his character in that moment, and even it's almost sentimental when he says like, I don't know whether you're going to keep the baby or not, but if you don't keep the baby, do not ever tell Mills. And if you do
Mm.
keep the baby, love it with everything you've got, and she
Yeah.
tears up when he says that. And
Yeah.
I mean, in any other movie that might be cheesy, but given this movie, like it's
Yes.
And it's
just
Morgan
such a
Freeman
sliver
singing
of
it.
hope.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
the first like hopeful, positive-ish thing. Like, it's the most optimistic he's been all movie, in a way. You know what I mean? Like, and like it is showing that side of him that's like, and like they do it from the beginning. He's a more sensitive cop than most of these guys. He's the one that's thinking about how are the people feeling around all that. You know what I mean? And so yeah, I love the moment as well. I think it makes him that much more endearing, and it's just a powerful moment. I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
then
then
it's
we're
interesting.
go for-
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, you go. No, you go ahead. You go
I was
ahead.
just going to say from there, we get the most action-packed part of the movie because this is where the
Mhm.
library card stuff comes in.
Yeah.
And so basically, for me, the Act 3 goal, what I put down was to generate their own leads because Mills has kept saying, we can't just keep sitting around waiting for people to die and investigating the scenes. How are we going to be more proactive about this? And then that's where Somerset comes up with the idea. Maybe a little bit. I suppose you could be a slightly critical of the movie at this point. In terms of there is this do ex machina. It's like, oh, by the way, the FBI happens to trace, all of the book checkouts. Although maybe it's
Right.
a little bit ahead of its time because I think after 9/11 we would have just been like, oh yeah, of course the FBI started doing shit like that.
Yeah.
In
I mean,
1995,
they
it
definitely were doing that.
Yeah.
In 1995, 100%.
Who knows?
No,
It feels like a
they
little
were
bit of
doing it.
a
Sure,
plot
it's a little
device.
convenient. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
But still,
the sentiment
you
is
buy
set
it.
up in the
Yeah.
beginning because he's like, this is what we do. We collect clues. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like this is our roadblock, right? And then they go
Yeah.
through their thing, and it's kind of like, well, let's not just collect clues anymore.
Yeah.
So it
Yeah.
is set up. It is set up for that for sure. And yeah, you're right. I get what you're saying. The sentiment.
And by the way, I don't think it's a huge deal. I mean, I think it's a pretty minor convenience that it gives the characters.
Yeah.
Compared to what we normally see in movies.
And he still had to
yes.
figure out where to go for it. It's not like it was just it handed in the answer. It was still him, piecing things together to look for that at all. You know what I mean? So I think
and then
it
they
doesn't
look
feel it doesn't feel like just gifted to him.
Right.
It's a little convenient how he figures it out, but that's such a tiny moment, and then we're straight into like the chase. Getting to John Doe. So it
is
works
interesting.
Fine.
I will disagree with you a little bit in the sense that it's a small moment in a way, but actually the movie kind of takes its time with it, right? Like, they come up with the idea, they meet this guy at a diner, they pay him the money, then they have to go to, I guess they're at a barber shop a few hours later, sitting there just waiting, and Mills is like, he can't take it, right? He's like, he's just so wants to be doing something. So it is kind of interesting that the movie doesn't just handle it with a phone call and an exchange. Like there's actually a couple of scenes where the movie is like drawing this out and kind of building this suspense until they get the list, and then they sort of discover, a guy named John Doe, and they discover the I think it's the St. Augustine book that sort of really clues Somerset in, and then they go to the apartment.
You're right. I do think though, to me, those scenes are more like character. I mean, I think the moment of Brad Pitt getting more and more frustrated and more that is what those scenes are about more than
Oh,
like
absolutely. I
right?
think they're
And
great.
so,
I'm not
so it doesn't
complaining about them
no
at all.
yeah sorry I was just saying like
You better not
the
be,
right
Chris. That's what
the
I-
process is drawn out, but like it's not about the process when they're doing
Right.
it. It's about Brad Pitt's character getting more and more tense throughout the film, and getting ready to set him up for what the ending is. So but yes, I agree. And I think it's smart to do that. It's smart to put our characters in places where they're frustrated and aren't making progress and aren't just like figuring out plots, so that we can just see them stew a little bit. We can just develop that a little bit more.
Yeah, and then so minute 8, they find John Doe's house. There's the shootout, and this is the great. This is like a very common thing, I think, that a lot of filmmakers know. But there's a great use of we're still and steady through most of the movie, but whenever we have like the SWAT team busting in, when we have this shootout, the camera becomes more active. It becomes more like we're handheld, or we're
Hectic,
kind of getting
yeah.
we're getting in the space of Brad Pitt's character sort of thing, and what he's going through. And I always think whenever he puts the gun up to his head and the water's going down, first of all,
Yeah.
again, I'm sure it absolutely sucks when you're doing it in the middle of it, but the product you get when you shoot
Right.
with rain
Yeah.
is always like everything. Rain makes everything better, specifically fight scenes. It always does. Try to challenge me on it. But the shot where he has like the gun pressed up to his head and the gun's in focus and he's
Yeah.
out of focus, John Doe, it's like I last night I leaned over to Kimberly, I was like, it's so good.
Yeah.
Like it's just like
Yeah.
I don't know, or even like the puddle when he's walking in the reflection of the puddle. I'm like, I don't know if I could have thought
Right.
of that. And it's
Well,
depressing a little.
even earlier when they're like running the fingerprints and you're looking at the screen, it's like so the camera is so close to those like CRT screens that it's like everything's blurry. Like,
Yeah.
and it's just like it's like, okay, it works so well and it feels so much like a part of the vibe of the movie, but it's just like those kind of decisions they feel brilliant, and they feel like what you're like, yeah, was that part in the script? Is that the part that you just figure out on set? Like, okay, we're gonna have a shot of the fingerprint records going, but what if we make it blurry because it doesn't really matter what they can read, and it just it's great. It's great.
It's so
Yeah,
good.
another interesting thing about the chase scene too is how confusing in a way it is. Fincher is obviously the kind of filmmaker who could make the space completely understandable, and to some extent it is generally we sort of have a sense of where Somerset is in relation to John Doe, at least some of the time. But then Mills and John Doe. But then Somerset has gone off this completely different place, and we're like, where the hell is he in relation to them? And it kind of confuses everything. But of course, that confusion is part of the whole feeling of, you're hunting down this guy. He's got a gun. He could be anywhere. And so the cutting becomes very interesting. It's not overly frenetic, but it's still like, wait, where is he in relation to them? And like, obviously he's not going to jump through windows, and he's taken he's sort of taken the long, slow route, but still it kind of creates this sense of confusion as to where we are and what's happening until we get to I can't remember if it's a garbage truck or whatever, but the truck that John Doe has climbed on top of.
The blocking also makes John Doe like enigmatic, because like whenever Brad Pitt turns a corner, it's like he's at the end of the hallway every time.
Yeah,
He's like the far end of it. And it's like, is this guy like Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers? Like he just he's gone, he's like teleporting almost. And so it just makes him like seem. And also I love his costume. He's wearing the hat, he's wearing like the huge jacket, and he's just completely
trench
dark.
coat, right?
He's like literally death itself. And it's
and to me he looks, there's so much of this movie that's parable-esque. It's like you don't know the name of the city. You don't it feels like this is more of a tale that's could be told in any city, or it's happened a million times everywhere. And so it's really interesting that he like is dressed up as like this like prototypical like noir villain almost, right? Like he's like a guy in a trench coat with a big hat and a gun. That's like the villain on every noir film, And so I think it's interesting how he just is like, we don't know who he is, so he could be anybody, and he's just this kind of like, he just looks like any bad guy in any city could look like. I just think it's just a I don't know. It's a brilliant way to like they found him, they found a lead, but they really, especially once they lose him, they haven't got anything. You know, he in the same way that this story could happen anywhere, it's almost like a serial killer could be anybody. You know, they could dress up like that. I don't know. I just think it's a fun element.
Well, there'll be even more commentary on that too whenever John Doe does reveal himself too, and like how he looks when he walks to the station versus how he's operating on his own.
Right.
So I have it here that once they, of course, Mills is pretty pissed off and doesn't really care about protocol, and I don't blame him. And so he ends up busting through. And also, it's a weird thing too that I kind of commented last night. It's like, well, Somerset, surely people are going to be reporting that there was a gun, like people were shooting guns, and like, what do you mean the cops aren't going to? I mean, maybe the city's so bad, no one would have come if they,
Right.
whatever. But it's just kind of
You're right. He does have a built-in excuse. See, they could have just said, "Oh, we thought we heard gunshots from inside the apartment," right? Whether they're right.
Yeah, it's a little wonky there, I think, but it's not the end of the world. It still gives them more fun things to do, like kick it through a door.
It is weird that they take the time to actually show them paying off the junkie woman in terms of her sort of making up the story. Because I think, in a way we almost don't need it, and I've been guilty of that occasionally too, where it's sort of over explaining, like making sure that there are no plot holes, sort of like, oh, well, we got to explain how they dealt with this. And like, I don't know that we needed to. But either way, that gets us into John Doe's apartment. And then, of course, again, we get our amazing production design again, and we get, the thousands of notebooks and all the trophies and the various things that
it does also kind of paint their characters more, because when Somerset breaks the law, he's going through the FBI, but then when Mills does it, he's going through like a homeless person or someone. It's like it just shows like they're like, again,
the way they bend the rules is even different.
Yeah, exactly. A knife versus a scalpel sort of situation. But anyway, there's a little parallel there too that's interesting. So we're into the inside John Doe's house at an hour and 16 minutes. And of course, this is like Donovan Thompson heaven here, seeing all the production design. And I never noticed it until this time, though. I don't know how. But it's because it's not really shown. It's not really. It's like the camera doesn't sit on it very long. But we're seeing like these trophy cases of mementos, and I've seen this maybe like probably 6-7 times now. I never noticed that like they were all in the same kind of box. But you only see like 3 of them or something. And I was like, oh damn, that's super cool. Like I never noticed that. But of course, also this is a thing about the Batman too. The newest one, right? Obviously, Seven's a huge inspiration for that movie, and like the notebook taking like all the scribbles was taken directly from Seven.
Right.
So the Seven obviously has its tentacles into a lot of different things in the last 30 years. But anyway, great stuff here. And we get a phone call at an hour and 21, telling us where I don't think, did we find out? No, this is just basically like you couldn't find me kind of thing, or you couldn't catch me sort of thing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But they do it's interesting because if I remember correctly, they do get a clue for the next crime there, right? Because they find the receipt from Wild Bill's leather shop. And then I guess they find that on Friday. It's not till Saturday that they actually find the victim. And I can't quite remember whether they start the search. And they also find the woman, right? They find the picture of the blonde woman. And so they go to the shop and they get a picture, which we don't see, of the instrument that this guy has created, but we also know that there's this prostitute that they're on the lookout for, and that gets us to Saturday. So it's interesting that they do actually get leads. They're too late. They can't stop the crime, but they did get leads by breaking into John Doe's apartment. It's just it doesn't help them, or it's too late.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking about stuff we're doing.
And that's kind of, and it's I guess to a degree, like, the killer's always a step ahead of them, right? Yeah. Throughout the entire movie. That's how it is. But it is if we're getting towards the end, man, I'm gonna save this for the ending. Because I think this is better for the ending. No, it's just I guess it's just interesting to me how like everything's thought out, but then some things feel like so improved by him at the end that it almost feels a little more like Michael Myers, a little more like how he changed his plans or what he had all these murders planned out in one. I mean, one of them literally years. He started it a year ago, but then he didn't have the last two planned out, and he just kind of improv that once he realized who these cops were that were chasing him. I don't know. There's just something that's a little.
Inspiration is a funny thing sometimes.
But I guess to me, it's that he didn't already have those two murders planned out in another way. Maybe he did. Maybe he was making it up as he went.
Yeah.
But
I get again, it's a little Joker. You're right, but it's also, he's
it is
insane. He's insane.
interesting. Yeah, he does have. It seems like he has crime number 4 planned out, but he does seem to have to execute it faster, right? Because he's ordered this custom designed giant dildo blade sword thing. So
that's the title of this episode, by the way. That's
yeah. so he obviously has planned that, but he puts it into effect immediately because after he escapes,
sure.
Obviously, we know that he's held a gun to this guy's head, so he's made it happen on that Saturday, right?
Isn't the phone call? Does he say you've changed my timetable? Does he? I think
Yes.
he tells him.
Yeah,
okay,
you're right.
Well,
Yes,
here's the
you're
interesting
right.
thing about serial killer movies, and it's something that Daniel and I are working on right now in ours. Is there's the two things that are happening. One, the cops are finding some crime scenes because they're found, but at the same time, like they're just found by the public or someone else. But at the same time, the killer is telegraphing the next crime scene and his previous crime scene. So
Right.
there's this weird thing here, and like again, it works because I was going to say, does he telegraph? I don't think he telegraphs the lust crime scene in the sloth one, does he? Like he doesn't have. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
No.
I don't think there's any. I was trying to remember how we find out about the pride.
Well, we found out about sloth, right, because of the fingerprints from the
fingerprints,
previous
right.
one.
Right.
So again, there's this weird thing of like, would we have found out about sloth? If they so like in some cases,
Yeah.
John Doe is telegraphing. In some cases, he's just letting the
He's
public
not,
find him.
right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's an interesting thing there of like balancing of like when to do that as structurally, and then also why is he not being consistent through his signature? So
Yeah.
anyway, there's
Well,
an
it's interesting
thing
because
there.
it is a little convenient. They get led to the ones that they would have no reason to find, almost like who would check this drug house for sloth kind of thing, or who would a prostitute. I'm sure that would be found eventually, but that's also a person that might not be reported immediately if someone was found her. And so I guess like the ones that they don't get led to, which is like the attorney and then Pride, those are people that it would have been notable. I mean, an attorney dies, everyone's going to find out about it. A model, it's going to be news. You know what I mean? Like that's not the same category as like prostitute and whatever. And so it is a little convenient, but it also like when you're watching it, it doesn't feel.
No, it doesn't.
You know what I mean?
Just,
It works.
It's fascinating though, just in
Yeah.
terms of when to choose to
Yes.
bring them to the next moment, and then what? And I guess what's more interesting to me is they're getting away with it. Because that's something that we're struggling with right
Right.
now.
Sure.
We're not struggling with, but we've really went through the gambit trying to make it all match up and like the signature to be consistent. But it almost feels like it doesn't have to be 100% consistent.
It's what we know. I mean, like to a degree, once we're invested in these characters, the plot starts mattering less, and we just are on the journey, right? But it is interesting that like this movie is incredibly intelligent. It's all constantly working at all these levels, but there are times still where it's still just a movie. You know what I mean? It's still just it's a plot, and we got to get to the next thing. And I think too, honestly, the grotesqueness of each murder does a lot, I think, to even paper over some of that, right? Like it's just as soon as you're there, it's like
awful, but it's fun.
You can't look away. Yeah.
I also think it's important to note that the way they discover the murders impacts their reaction to them. And, so for example, I said that the Act 3 goal was to generate their own leads. And it's sort of like, well, what's the conclusion of that? Like, how do you climax that? Well, I think the end of Act 3 is that they find the lust victim, and they're devastated, I think, more by that one than they've been by anything else. If you remember, this is where Mills is they're in the interrogation rooms. Excuse me. Mills is interrogating the sort of the sex house brothel place, the owner of that place, and then Somerset's talking to the I guess the John,
The guy.
And afterwards we see them both just sitting in their rooms just with nothing. And and Act 3 has become really interesting because they did generate their own leads. They almost caught John Doe and failed, and then they got clues to John Doe's next murder, and they almost again sort of, I mean, we don't know how close they were, but obviously it had kind of just happened, right?
It's
like,
the most recent murder victim they find.
like the guy is still there. The guy who did, who had sex with the prostitute, he's still there. So like it has just happened. So the fact that this murder, that they finally felt like they were getting a little ahead of the game, or they were getting some leads, and maybe they didn't have to wait for the next one, they still fail at. And I think that one, obviously minus the very end of the movie, is the most crushing one of all of them, because they were so close so many times.
Well,
and you add in the photo, right? You add in that when they're in the house, he realizes that John Doe was the photographer. So there's 3 times they realized during Act 3 that they almost had him and didn't. And so that Act 3 climax, which is of course very stereotypical of any movie, is kind of them at their lowest. Is like, man, even when we get information, even when we disrupt his timetable and figure things out, we still can't close the deal, right?
And we're also seeing the reaction we saw with the wife to the lawyer, but we're seeing, and this is what I mentioned earlier in the podcast, where the guy's performance, the guy who, had to kill the girl essentially.
Yeah.
His performance, every time I see it, I'm like, it blows my mind of like how real it feels, and how destroyed that guy is. And like, it blows. I'm like speechless every time I watch it. But I think it's also adds to their lowest point, as we're getting a real time, really devastating look at how these crimes are affecting other people too, just besides them finding them and have to deal with them on their own.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to echo what...
I can't remember that guy's name, but he's a really great character actor.
Gosh, I'm telling you guys, that scene is crazy.
So the interesting thing then about at the end of Act 3, sort of into Act 4, is that the end of Act 1 into Act 2 and the end of Act 2 into Act 3 have both featured Tracy, right? So Tracy calls at the beginning of Act 2, and then they have dinner. The end of Act 2, she calls Mills, and then they have breakfast at the beginning of Act 3. At the end of Act 3 into Act 4, we don't have anything with Tracy, but we do have the key scene between Somerset and Mills at the bar, kind of drowning their sorrows. And this is where Mills calls out Somerset on what he thinks is his bullshit story for retiring, and saying, I don't think you feel this way. I think you're saying you feel this way to justify why you're retiring. And I think it's really interesting, because Somerset has always been the smarter one and the one who can read situations better. And for the first time, I think we see Mills is probably right on the money in terms of him calling out Somerset and having read Somerset correctly. And then, of course, we need that really at the end of that Act 3 in order to justify what we're going to get at the very end of the final act, in terms of the voiceover that we're going to talk about from Somerset.
Yep. It's all great. I mean, like, I was just going to mirror you. I agree. It's such a great way to, in some ways it's prototypical, but the way to make our heroes feel the lowest at the end of Act 3. I do like that they think they're getting ahead of him, but even when they find that picture, I feel like when they find the picture of themselves in the house, there's also, I mean, obviously that's foreshadowing that he's targeting them now. He's aware of them. But also it's just like it's another hint that maybe, again, he's already a few steps ahead. But it is, the way that they almost have him, the way that, you know, they think they're finally outsmarting the smartest killer they've ever found. And then to find out, I mean, he kind of just beats them, I guess, by luck, or just, I mean, yeah, he teleports maybe a little bit, but like, you know, it's they're beaten in ways that like cops should be able to outrun. You know, in theory, like should be athletic, should be able to catch, you know, run after people and catch them, but they can't even do that, even if they can outsmart them. You know, I just like it.
Yeah, and there's a great line here that kind of paints. It's basically he's trying to protect Mills from what's going to happen to him later, and he says he's not the devil, he's just a man.
Yeah.
And like, and that's really, he's trying to be like, look, this is what's gonna be more devastating at the end of this is when you realize that anyone could do this, and it's not some mythological thing. That's one thing, like when you talk about like you know, this is what it is, but a lot of people were like, oh, Hitler was a very specific person at a specific time, and it's probably more likely that a lot of people under the right circumstances can become really bad and do bad things. That's much more scarier, and it's more comforting to think the opposite of like, oh, Hitler was just once in a lifetime thing. It's like, no, the scarier, more truthful thing is that this is a thing that can happen and will happen throughout history.
Yeah.
So
we head into Act 4, and it's Sunday, and it's our last day, and we get 3 murders on Sunday. So, which is maybe a little ironic, but also, and you guys will have to help me remember. But basically, Sunday starts with the 5th crime, with Pride. Like, it almost feels a little rushed. I mean, we see Sunday, and we're just there, and we're getting this, you know, she cut off her nose to spite her face. Like, I don't know if I was distracted in that moment, but it almost went by so fast that I almost missed the mechanics of the crime, you know, in terms of what had happened and what she'd done, because it's just so like, okay, you know, we're getting this crime, right? And we don't spend much time on Pride before they head back to the police station, and then, you know,
it's more about like, and this is something that Daniel and I are running into in ours, is that it's more about fulfilling the mythology than adding to the story.
Well, it's not about the murders anymore. It's about him. Like, once we found him, once we know he's out there and we've kind of identified him, even if we don't know what he looks like, it's like, yeah, we found another murder, but the idea that they would find more clues that would lead him to him again is like less likely, I guess, right? Like, they've already found him once, they've already found where he was hiding, they already found his plan. So it's like it is a good murder. I think it's a, you know, I like it in like its concept, the way, like you said, the way it's set up, and just the technique, what's going on, and how he killed her or made her kill herself. But it is like, I don't think we need to spend as much time with it as we did.
What else could they do with it?
And greed.
Yeah, what's it gonna do for the plot? You're right.
Exactly.
There's sort of nothing new they can discover. There's no point in spending extra time on it.
It's a moment where the writer's probably like, I wish there was only 6 deadly sins. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly. It's got to fit another murder in there.
Yeah, it's fulfilling the mythology to make the fun of it work.
Yeah, I should go. You know, I should mention here, since you mentioned the screenwriter, a long time ago, it was probably 2015. I went to the Austin Film Festival and actually got to see Andrew Kevin Walker talk about Se7en.
That's cool.
Don't know if I have notes somewhere of any insights that he had about it, but but that was pretty
awesome.
cool.
That's very cool. Very cool.
So I think one of the really fascinating things structurally about this movie is that, you know, they find it's Sunday. I think we're in Act 4. They find the 5th crime. They go back to the police station, and then John Doe shows up. And that feels like it should be a climax, right? It feels like it should be the climax of an act.
Right.
But it really isn't. It really just, because it's not, you know, directly oriented specifically. I mean,
it's a surprise, right? And it's like it feels, but you're right. It again, like the typical movie finding him, catching him being in cuffs is the climax. But this is like, it comes way too early, and that makes it unsettling, right?
Yeah.
Like you immediately, of course he's covered in blood, so obviously we know something's been happening. But it's also just that, like, oh shit, more shit's about to go down, and this is a part of the plan. You know what I mean? So I think it feels, it doesn't at all feel like, you know, victorious at all when they've got him, even though there's some people acting like it.
Well, yeah, and we know, and finally, you know, we get the sense, you know, that Mills is finally, you know, caught up with Somerset, because they've arrested him, and both of them are like, this isn't the end of the story, you know.
Right.
There's two more murders, and we don't know what his plan is. We don't know if they have happened or he has some mechanism to make them happen. But we can't just say, oh, he's been arrested and we're done. Like, they both know that the story is not over yet, right? And then, of course, we immediately get the attorney showing up and sort of saying, okay, you know, he will show you the other two bodies, you know, which, of course, is not exactly accurate. It is, I guess,
But brilliant.
Yeah, kind
by
of
Toby from The West Wing, right? Daniel, is that right? Is that Toby's character? Is that Toby?
What does he do? Yeah, I know who Toby is.
Yeah.
Oh, it is his. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, he's great. He's a great actor.
He's played a lawyer in several things.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I mean, you know, minute 30 or hour and 34, John Doe arrives. I think the movie's like 2 hours and 4 minutes or something.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this last 30 minutes here is kind of incredible, because it's almost just this long car ride for a very long. I stopped taking notes at this point, because I was like, I know what happens the rest of the movie. I probably can do without it. And I just wanted to enjoy it. I didn't want to take notes during it. And so it's this long car ride, and we're getting these long dialogue moments between Mills and John Doe, and we're getting, of course, why John Doe does what he does, then them kind of picking at each other, getting on each other's skin. And I mean, it's fantastic. And kind of to talk earlier about, you know, whenever we see John Doe in his supervillain garb versus when he comes in, I mean, Kevin Spacey already kind of looks, you know, when he walks in, he's covered in blood, but he kind of looks like a mischievous guy anyway. But it's still, you know, he's still an everyman. Like, he's still an everyman, which makes it even more terrifying. Of course, when he speaks, he doesn't sound like an everyman, but incredible performances all the way around. And yeah, I don't really have too much to say about this until we get to the next part. But
well, one thing I will say about the car conversation is, I think it's interesting as sort of quote unquote brilliant as John Doe has been in how he set up all these murders. You know, Mills keeps just saying, you know, he has said earlier to Somerset that this guy's crazy, he's insane, and Somerset's like, no, but he means crazy in the sense of like, you know, Somerset.
He's at least a sociopath, right?
Yeah,
like
he's meticulous.
He says he has no remorse for victims, and he's planning out these, you know.
But yeah, I mean, initially when Mills says he's crazy and Somerset disagrees, he's saying like,
yeah, he's
crazy in the sense that like he's just randomly doing shit. He's very meticulous. He's got all of this planned. But then when they're in the car and we get to hear more of Mills or John Doe's justification, and Mills again, I think, says you're crazy. But the thing is, he's right. You know, at that point, he is right. Like, John Doe really just is crazy. I mean, it doesn't mean he's not incredibly smart and intelligent and can figure out these amazing things. But he is crazy, and he is totally inconsistent in his beliefs that, you know, he's making the world a better place by punishing, you know, prostitutes and stuff like that for their crimes. Yet he is immune from that, you know, those same sins because somehow he's doing the work of God, or, you know, I mean, it really doesn't add up. And Mills is right.
And especially Tracy doesn't fit the pattern either, right? She's not she isn't guilty of anything. Obviously, it's like she's using her to bait wrath and stuff like that. And I guess in a way, it's like he's punishing himself by killing Tracy because he wanted her to
Well,
a
he
degree,
says
maybe,
it's
but
envy, and I mean, his justification is, "I envied your life," you know.
and that feels a little bit weak to me, just
It's
in terms of
stretching it for sure.
yeah,
Well,
and
I
it's
mean,
just like
again,
But yeah, and whether he's making that up or not, yeah, it's hard to
right,
say. But it also, I think, you could sort of justify it in the sense that the lust crime works kind of similarly, in the sense that he's sort of blaming the prostitute, but the
sure,
John is as big a sinner in all of that as the prostitute, and so two people get punished, you know,
right.
and obviously one dies and one doesn't. Um, and so he's already justified, I think, the fact that there can be collateral damage, in the sense that maybe he's
But
going to
it's
kill Tracy to enact his own envy. But yeah, I guess it is
I hear
punishing
you.
himself.
it
You're
I just
right.
think
it
that
doesn't make
No,
sense.
it's-
I
I
think you're
think
right, Daniel.
that the rest of the murders are kind of what at least some people can consider like fringe society people, like people that aren't really fully accepted by society, like like people that are massively overweight, lawyers that are bad, are always helping bad people out of situations, all the prostitute, and even the model is like the model, I guess, is the one where it starts to get a little blurry because is she like a blight on society? But you could justify like, well, she's making people have unrealistic expectations for their body or something. But
Right.
Tracy is like innocent. Tracy isn't any of these things. She's a
And
stay-at-home mom.
she's not
Her
apparently
future
envious
stay-at-home
of
mom.
anybody. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
She is not
Yes.
committing any of these sins, whereas you can argue everyone else was a sinner in his eyes.
Yeah, and I guess he does sort of say he's punishing. I mean, I guess the logic is he's punishing himself.
Right. That is where it really starts to break down in terms of like,
Right.
okay, he's actually crazy. You know what I mean?
Right,
Because it's
right.
like, are you punishing yourself since you feel no remorse and you
But I
like
think,
killing?
but I think that works. One, because as you guys have pointed out, he is like making things up now, and he's,
Right.
Maybe he's no longer, maybe he's acting as much now out of anger towards these cops who are getting closer to catching him than he thought they would be.
Sure.
Um,
Sure. Yeah, you could argue that this is him punishing them for trying to stop him, right? Like this
Yeah.
is their and I think it works again because it's not, this moment isn't about that. It isn't about him getting punished. It's about Brad Pitt. It's about
Well,
Somerset. It's about
and the other thing I was going to say is that it works because in the end, you're right. He is crazy, and his methodology doesn't have to hold up. I mean,
right.
it's not like we can sit back and go, "Oh, the
Yeah.
movie doesn't work because this crazy serial killer's reasons for killing the last two people don't fit his pattern." Well, he's a
It's
serial
interesting.
killer, and in the end, he is crazy, and he's using his structure to motivate his crimes, even if his motivations don't really add up. Who cares? He's a crazy serial killer in the end, right? And so I think it's okay that it's still a brilliant thing that he's done, from a
Right.
I'm messing with you point of view, even if his use of these biblical things are no longer in line with how he was doing it earlier. I mean, who cares in a way, right?
You're right. Yeah, that's an interesting. I mean, you're right. It's that like it having a serial killer not be crazy, or I guess Hannibal Lecter in some ways is like the other version of this, where it's like obviously he's got something wrong with him, but he's never he's consistent, right? Like his motives are
but
consistent.
his
His
is easier
methods are
because he doesn't
consistent.
have to abide by a mythology. He's created his own mythology. That's why it's easier to do.
Sure, that too. But it is, and it is interesting how even how we're writing ours, and like, oh well, we got to make him consistent throughout. But the character we're writing is not level-headed or
Right.
or sane, right? Like, and so there is room to be a little looser with that at some point, and maybe it is again at the end when the stakes are not about that anymore. It's about what Brad Pitt's going to do, and like that moment is so big that we aren't as worried about his methodology and his methods anymore. It's just an interesting observation.
No, it's correct, and it is interesting. but I would say you and I probably right now agree that this is the weaker part of the movie because
Sure.
we are poking holes in his logic, right? And Bruce is right, and of course that his logic doesn't make really much sense to
It's
begin
the
with because
weaker part of the movie and maybe the best serial killer movie of all time.
yeah,
Right?
I
Right?
know, yeah, exactly.
And it's only weak when you dissect it because when you're watching it, it does not appear weak. It does
Right,
not
and it's
feel
only
weak.
weak because his mythology starts to break down in terms of what he's done. I mean, it's
It's still
obviously one of the
it's he's
great
still really
endings, right? It's
yes.
one of the great endings
He
of
still
in a
wins,
movie,
right?
of what he's done and what he's sort of forcing to happen. And we can say the mythology breaks down, but Brad Pitt does kill him out of wrath, and
It's like his logic breaks down, but his prophecy still kind of comes to pass, right?
yeah,
Like, and so
Well, because he changes the rules. That's why.
sure, you're
I
right.
mean,
Yeah,
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 100%. Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, yeah, this is all great. I mean, when they're driving into the final battle here, you see all the cell phone towers, whatever it is, or the electrical towers. It's like, and I've heard them say this before and other stuff. It's like, the way it's shot and the telephoto lens, it's all compressed. It's like they're literally going to like the spider web, the trap, you
Mm,
know,
Yeah.
and some great
Yeah.
symbolism
It's
there.
also interesting too because the whole movie has taken place in the city and in the rain,
yeah,
and
yeah,
now suddenly we're out in the country and it's not raining anymore, and yet somehow it doesn't feel any better. You know what I mean? Like
right.
it doesn't feel
I've never thought
happier
about
or
that
more
actually.
open.
No,
It's all these electrical wires. It feels empty. It feels like it's
desolate. Yeah, yeah. He feels.
sort of
Yeah,
this desolate industrial space that's there to
yeah.
support the city, but there's nothing really great about it in it of itself. Um, yeah, and then just the way everything plays out, the way the van comes, we've got the helicopter, we've got the van coming, we've got obviously the Joker moment might be, and not entirely, but because it could work either way, but that Somerset goes to the van first rather than Mills. It could have been the other way around.
Sure.
Sure.
Although I suppose Mills probably would have done the same thing, so maybe it doesn't change the overall scheme of how it all plays out.
We
But
just wouldn't have the
certainly,
dramatic
yeah, it
moment where
certainly
he's
makes
trying
it
to
more
plead with him, and
dramatic.
yes, yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
would have happened quicker probably if he's opened up and saw his dead wife's head in there, probably.
Yeah.
Exactly. He would just done that and just shot him. The movie's over.
And he never
Credits
sees
roll.
it. And by the way, he never sees his
Right,
dead
right.
wife's head in the box, right?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
you know, there are. It's kind of funny because I think the most one of my favorite moments in the movie is when Somerset opens the box.
Mm.
I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something like pull back. John Doe has the upper hand.
Yeah.
And it's such a great line because he's on his knees, handcuffed with a gun to his head.
Yeah.
And Somerset saying I don't know, there's just something about the way he says that line. I just love it. It's like John Doe
So
has
good.
the upper hand, and there's nothing about anything that indicates that John Doe has the upper hand.
Yeah.
But it's like John Doe has the upper hand. And then of course, we can be critical or not, but Brad Pitt saying what's in the box has become
Yeah.
a
meme almost. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
has become an audio meme.
Yeah.
My wife and I make that joke all of the time.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
but the first time I saw the movie, I certainly didn't find it funny
No.
or over the top. But I think then
No.
when you watch it multiple times and you kind of know what's coming,
Well, if you just watch that scene on its own, it can feel a little ridiculous.
Yeah.
If you don't watch it in context of everything else. Yeah. No,
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like, I also really love the moment where Somerset sees the head, and also just because it's also that moment where, in most movies, this is the moment where the protagonist figures out how to win.
yeah,
But this is the moment the protagonist figures out they probably already lost, or they already lost.
they have lost.
And he's trying to prevent one more loss from happening. Like, that's the stakes at this point, right? I just think that's a brilliant inverse of what you typically get with just other movies and how protagonists usually work at the end.
Well, yeah, and one of
Goals.
the interesting things about this, and I've written about this on some of my other structure breakdowns, is when characters succeed at goals, but really they fail. Um, Technically, they've succeeded, right? Their goal is to
Yeah,
catch
they caught.
John
He's caught.
Doe and stop the crimes, and that has happened, right? So it becomes this weird mixed ending where technically it's a success, but in every emotional register, it's a failure, you know?
Yeah. Well,
and
and you could.
yeah,
There's an argument for saying they were trying to stop John Doe before he killed anymore, right? And like he finished. He didn't want to kill anymore. In theory, like this was the amount of people he had
yeah,
chosen to kill, and
but
he
they don't
finished his plan.
they don't. I mean, you could say that, but their goal isn't to stop the murders because they think the murders have already taken place.
Well,
Okay.
not after Sloth though, right?
Yeah,
I mean, like,
well, that's the exception would be Lust, as they.
No,
try
I mean,
to say Lust.
I mean, the
Yeah, less.
agreement with the attorney is, he
That
will
they-
show
yeah.
you, he will reveal the last two murders
Sure.
if
That's
you,
true.
you know, under these conditions. Now, I think they're suspicious and they think he's got something up his sleeve, but I don't think that they think that they're gonna stop any more murders.
No, I'm more saying just movie level goal. Talking about the movie level goal of stopping John Doe, stopping the murders. They fail at that. They catch him, but they fail at stopping the murders.
they don't even really catch him. Actually, he just walks in.
Well,
there.
you're
I mean,
right.
They catch him.
He is
but-
apprehended by his own volition, but I don't know.
You could
There's
argue
just
that their intervention made John Doe want to be caught by them. You know, you could say that too.
Exactly.
that seems evident.
It
Yeah.
is, but I'm saying like if you want to bend it, you know.
But it is tricky, right? Because if the Act 4 goal is to discover the final two victims, well, they're successful.
you're right.
They discover the final two victims, but in a horrible way, right? Again, and that's what kind of brilliant is like that. Technically, it's successful, but not in any. Normally,
Correct.
a successful goal makes us feel good, and that they've you know that it's a happy thing, and that's not the case here at all. And then with the movie level goal, I mean, I still think the movie level goal, you know, you can say
He's
I
brought
still
to
think-
justice, right? He's going to get justice. There,
Yeah,
so
and well, yeah, because he gets shot, right?
right, yeah,
But you know, to Donovan's point, you know, in a way, we can't really know what would have happened if they hadn't forced John Doe's hand.
Well, there's an argument that it would have played out all the same way, but less tragic because it wouldn't have gotten so personal, right?
Well,
There's an argument that he would have killed the same amount of people, maybe even still turned himself in. But
that's
it
what we
wouldn't have
don't
been
know, right?
Bill's
We don't
wife.
know whether he would have turned himself in. We
Sure.
don't know whether he'd always planned for himself to be the last victim. I suspect not. And maybe, you know, it's really hard to know. I mean, obviously, we can't ever know his motives for turning himself in, other than he has figured out a way to get revenge on, or revenge, whatever, to sort of get at Mills by killing Tracy and then forcing, you know, sort of triggering Mills into killing him. We don't know whether he had planned on dying after all of this, right? For all we know, he was going to get away with all of this and still be out there and, you know, go through the Bible and come up with
14.
you know,
Sure.
some other new mythology
well, I
to start
think
killing under, right?
It is interesting just because in real life, though, almost none of these people actually turn themselves in. It's always they get caught, and the implication later is they wanted to be caught. Like
Yes.
they were either leaving clues, whatever they wanted to be on some level, stop because they did recognize they were doing something that wasn't great.
Well, and
on
they
some
hinted that,
level.
right? The help me. That's what's written in the fingerprints. And at first they think, oh, this is the killer saying he wants to get caught, right?
But
Like
also,
they,
too, sometimes
they
it's
play
a
with that a
game,
little bit.
right? Sometimes they leave the clues not
It's-
because they
it's-
want to be caught, but because it's
They think
the
they're smart. They
thrill.
like leading them along.
Yeah,
They
it's
think they're
the
smarter,
thrill
yeah.
of exactly
Yes,
of
yes.
outsmarting
Yeah.
the cops, and
Yeah,
that
well, it's a classic thing where a killer will go back to the crime scene, which he does, and he takes a photo of them. It's
Yeah.
like they typically insert themselves into the investigation. They try to help out in some way.
Right.
They're there when the reporters are there. They typically are people who try to get into the military who were rejected because of some psychological evaluation because they
Yeah.
wanted to quote unquote help people or be a political or be an officer or something like that or someone in the military. It's like it's almost like it's crazy how standardized it is across the board of like there's certain things it's like they
Yeah.
almost all do this in a way. But that's why I'm saying I don't know. I think what's interesting about John Doe is that he actually turns himself in, and I think that I don't know. I kind of actually believe the opposite, where yes, there's obviously the version in real life where he would have come up with another, the Ten Commandments or something crazy that's also biblical, whatever, to keep going because they typically do that. But he is different because he actually turns himself in, and in the car ride, it feels like he thinks he is. I think he believes
He's
his
a
own
martyr.
sauce
He sees
here.
himself as a martyr, I think, right through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Even the idea that it's like, he's doing this because God told him to send a message about sin. And like, he doesn't feel remorse because he believes the shocking nature of the murders will draw attention and,
Change the
it'll
world,
spotlight.
yeah.
Exactly. But I agree, Donovan. I think in this movie, in this make-believe kind of world, he was always going to turn himself in. And so it's just one of it's obviously if they don't get involved we don't have a movie. So it's like we need
Mills
that, but
and Mills and Somerset don't know that he's going to turn himself
and
in.
yes, exactly.
So again, if their movie level goal is to sort of stop him, they have stopped him even if that was part of his plan, right?
Sure, you're right. You're right.
It becomes really interesting.
It becomes it's complicated, and I think it's interesting because of that.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's like, well, they kind of both win in ways that like the killer seemed to be. I think he felt better than anyone else there. John Doe
for sure. Yeah,
he was smiling when he got shot.
Exactly, and so like it makes. I think that's why the ending's so famous, so complex, is because not only did he like make it personal all of a sudden and killed his wife and whatever, but it's like he wins and they lost. And that I think is honestly too what makes Somerset's decision at the end even more impactful, right? Choosing to stay, and that quote at the end.
Changing the subject, and then I think we need to get to like the very last lines and
yeah.
One little thing I just want to say is I completely admire the choice that we never see Tracy's head in the box.
I do too.
It's great. It's great.
Maybe it's because they didn't feel like they could pull it off in a realistic way that would look good, but also it just works. It works.
You don't need it.
Yeah, exactly. That you don't need it, and sort of the classic sort of leave it to your imagination kind of thing.
Well, and it kind of aligns you with Brad Pitt at the very end. When we've been aligned with Morgan Freeman the whole time, but now you're what's in. I mean, like there's even to me, there's always part of you like maybe it wasn't her, maybe it was a different blonde lady. So like there's this, because you don't see it, and so it kind of aligns us with him at the end of that. Like we don't get to see what we know is there, and it's frustrating. It's frustrating as like a viewer in a way that works really well.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen Kimley as invested in a movie in a long time, but I think the end made her not like the movie. So I think
if you want a happy ending, you're not getting it. So I get it. Yeah.
But I think here's where we get to the final question here.
Yeah.
Is that what kind of person are you? Is what I think is one way you're going to look at this movie. And of course, you guys know me by now. I look at it as an optimistic ending. Even though it's a terrible tragedy, it's still optimistic because he realizes he does care about people. And the reason why he even stops him, he knows that if Brad Pitt goes down that road, he's going to make his life harder in the end, and so he cares about Brad Pitt in the end. And that's why he wants him to stop. And not because he cares about John Doe winning or losing. He cares about Brad Pitt making a decision that will alter his life even further than it already has been altered.
I think there's a lot of things to say about that. One, I think, is a bit of a weakness. I have my doubts that Brad Pitt is ever going to regret killing John Doe.
You're right. I agree. I'm making a good final statement, Bruce.
But I also don't know if he can come back from it. It also, like the way he's looking when they're like taking him away, it's like, is he done? Is he like
his life may be destroyed?
Fucked?
Don't get me wrong. I mean,
like,
is he ever going to come back from the horror of all of this? No, but it's because of his wife, not because he shot John Doe.
Brad Pitt becomes the French Connection character. That's what happens.
Yeah, because I think also there's an implication that he will continue being a cop.
Yeah, me too.
Cops will cover this up. They will make sure
100%.
that he's not tried for this crime or anything. But I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, I think this gets back to Somerset being the protagonist, because if his external goal is to sort of stop these crimes, we call it mixed at best. The crimes have stopped, but obviously it has ended horribly and tragically, and he doesn't feel good about any of that. But if his internal goal has been to overcome his apathy, find the will to keep fighting for the world and to keep caring about the world, ironically, he has, right? I mean, he has found the will, and maybe it's because of what happened to Brad Pitt, but I think we can generalize it even more that in a way he's been faced with even worse depravity than he's ever seen before, and that's almost inspired him in a weird way, or forced him to say, I can't give up on the world. It's the world. I need to keep trying, right? And I mean, the quote that he quotes from Ernest Hemingway, the world is a fine place and it's worth fighting for. And he says, I don't think I can agree with the first sentence, but I can agree with the second sentence, right? He thinks the world's a miserable place still, but it's still a place worth fighting for. And anytime a character is successful with their internal goal, there is a sense of hopefulness there. Right. I mean, even as bad as this ending is, you get a sense of hopefulness. And we get this line at the end where they ask him, where can we find you, or something like that, and he says, I'll be around.
Right.
And that's a kind of a vague line, and I think they didn't want to sort of over deliver, but it seems pretty clear to me that he's not retiring.
Right. Yeah.
He is going to stay a cop. Whether he's still going to be partners with Brad Pitt, I'm not so sure, but he is staying a cop, and he's going to keep fighting for what he believes is right. And so I agree with you, Donovan. I think that creates an optimistic ending out of this horrible, horrible ending. And I think the great movie to compare it to, if either of you guys have seen it, is Chinatown. In Chinatown, we also have a really dark ending where the bad guy in that case gets away with it. He survives it. He gets away with it. And the final line is, let it go, Jake. That's Chinatown, and basically what they're saying is evil will win and you can't fight it. Right.
Yeah.
And so in a way, Chinatown to me has a darker ending, even though there isn't the same kind of murders and darkness of like the loss of life. The worldview of Chinatown is even darker. You can't fight it, especially because Chinatown's about wealthy people getting away with murder, and it's sort of like there's nothing you can do about it. But Somerset gives us some hope that we can keep fighting. That whatever bad in the world is, if we keep fighting, maybe we can at least hold it at bay, or at least we can be equal to it,
Well, and it's interesting because, Somerset in the beginning of the movie, it's all about how there's just senseless violence everywhere, right? Like they talk about, he anecdotes like some guy that was getting robbed, and then the dude just stabs him in the eyes for like no reason or whatever. And he's like, it's just senseless violence. It doesn't make sense anymore. I don't understand it. But this villain ends up being one he understands, right? It's more of like this conscious evil that he encounters. It isn't just random, people at pushed to the brink, hurting each other. It's someone who in some ways was seeing the same problems he was, but took the evil solution to it. Right. But it wasn't senseless. Like, is it crazy? Yes, but he was making some sense in his own weird, fucked up world. It wasn't just him reacting to a bad situation and it spirals out of control. And so it's interesting that Somerset decides to stay. It's almost like when he realizes the enemy is more than he thought it was, to a degree, right? He realizes that, and in some ways it's like, he's this brilliant, like he studies literature. Like he's always like, oh, that quote was out of whatever the thing was, and it wasn't relevant. It's just he's read that or knows it well or knows Ernest Hemingway well, right? And it's just interesting that it's like once he's more met his match with the evil, that's part. It's interesting that he decides to stay, and I wonder if there is part of that it's like it's him stepping up to the plate. Like it was sort of like, I know I'm good, I know I'm doing this, but I'm not making any difference because it just keeps happening. It's a cycle of violence. It happens everywhere. But then this one instance of a very particular person doing a very particular thing that makes him want to keep fighting.
Well, I also think it gets back to Donovan's point earlier about him caring, and maybe you mentioned it even earlier, Daniel, about him caring about individuals, you know.
Yes.
Tracy has been killed and he hasn't had a personal connection with someone. And obviously I think it's more of you, Donna, you mentioned him maybe caring about Mills at the end, but I think it's more about Tracy, you know, and maybe this sense of like, I can't step away because maybe next time I can save a Tracy, you know, I can keep this from happening to another Tracy. Like, and if I can do that, I've done something worthwhile. You know,
do we think, and I agree with all this, but do we think it would have been stronger to, there's no evidence other than his interactions at the movie. There's no evidence to support that that there is something to be fighting for. Because you know what I'm saying? There's nothing he can hold on to at the end of the movie other than his conversations with her. Like there's nothing else he has. You know what I'm saying? Like I do think that's a little weak there at the end, you know, like there's a classical way, this is a real shitty way of doing it, but like, you know, they're like, hey, there's another crime, whatever, and like there's a girl missing, or there's something that's like, you know, there's something at stake that's like, well, this is will die if I don't intervene. You know what I'm saying? Like there's something that it does feel weak and complicated.
I don't read it as weak. I just to me, it reads him as just a very interesting character that like this ends up being the thing that motivates him to stay. It's more darkness in a way.
I think there's a slight weakness to it in the sense that it's a voiceover and we just sort of pull back and we sort of end on that. It almost feels like, how do we end this movie? We can do it this way. But I also think to me, it fits Somerset's character. Like, I don't know that he needs a specific thing because he's a philosopher, you know, and his statement is abstract, but he lives in a world of abstractions. You know, he lives in his own mind. And he's had a mind shift, you know, and so I think he's had a change of philosophy and mind more than a practical change in the world, right? And also, I just think we need it because I think if he doesn't say that, the movie is almost so bleak. It's almost too much, you know. I mean, especially for what you imagine David Fincher wanted, which is a highly successful Hollywood style movie. Like, you know, if he doesn't say that and we just end on the total darkness and bleakness without the little shimmer of light from those lines, whew, I mean, that's rough, you know.
Very true.
Yeah. I mean, again, the movie to me is so perfect on so many levels. You know, there's this one of the rare cases where I can be okay with it and have a really bleak ending because I like good happy endings.
Yeah.
But this is so I needed that line from Somerset at the end. I do wonder if like maybe he was at the diner and someone opens the door and he looks and it's like some woman, he looks back down and then he says the line. You know, obviously it'd be way more on the nose then, but I still think it's like you're right, pulling out like that after just that all happening, it still feels just a smidge murky to me. And I mean, Kimberly I had to explain to Kimberly kind of what we're talking about now. Like, she's like, this is a horrible ending. I said, well, there's a sense of optimism at the end. I had to explain it to her. So I'm not sure most people would get that, you know?
Yeah.
It is weird. It is weird because you're right. It's like the character saying, I'm going to keep fighting for what? I mean, like why is he keeping fighting? He seemed to put everything he could into this case and he failed. So I think it is a little, and again, it's like, it's hard for me to call it weak as much as it is just like, it just makes it very complex. It makes his character more complex.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is odd in terms of just movies and how they usually treat us.
Yeah, it's odd. It is odd.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, guys, I think we ultimately did it. I'm not sure we solved the ending there, but I think I think again, it's one of those. It's an interesting thing, and maybe our listeners can write us in the comment section below. And Daniel, if they can't reach us there, how can listeners write into us?
Listeners, you can write into bit.ly/241mail and let us know, what is your interpretation of the ending of Seven? Why is Somerset willing to keep going? What is driving him through the next case, or to keep him there? We'd love your opinion. Write into us, bit.ly/241mail.
And of course, if you can, just up at our bit.ly, you can always find us on YouTube, youtube.com/@241studios. It's the best place to consume the content. Bruce, how can our listeners find you and all the cool things that you do?
They can find my Substack newsletter and website at thehutchfiles.com, where they can find a bunch of my act breakdowns. They can sign up to get the newsletter delivered straight to their email box. I'd actually already done a breakdown of Seven and posted it a long time ago, but once you guys have the video up, I'll link the video into it, and then I'll sort of repost it and send it out to everyone so that they can get all the specific, acts numbers and my other observations that we didn't get to.
It's great.
Well.
Question for you guys: if David Fincher decides to do a sequel called 8, would you ever want to see Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt to come back to do another film in this universe? To me, it seems sacrilegious, and there's no way they're going to make it work. But also, it's David Fincher, and he rarely misses.
I think I'd rather have another set of detectives.
Yeah, I'd rather him finish Mindhunter.
Well, that's true too.
Me
Yeah.
too.
So I'd rather David Fincher do nothing else but just finish Mindhunter. So that's.
Again, we before we did this, we talked about doing the game. We talked, and I think doing Gone
Talked about
Girl
Zodiac.
Zodiac. All of those are I think are so interesting, and Gone Girl would be crazy good because the middle of the movie completely changes perspective at one point. So I'm sure you have. You've broke down Gone Girl, right, Bruce?
Yeah, Gone Girl is actually the hardest breakdown I've ever done.
Yeah.
And really it's because I realized that, normally when you do a structure breakdown, you build it around a protagonist. And I realized that really, both characters are protagonists. And so they actually both have a complete act structure that's intercut between the two of them, which makes it incredibly difficult to sort of sort through and figure out what the heck's going on. But yeah, it's brilliantly structured for sure.
Crazy good. I remember seeing I think that's my first David Fincher film in theaters. And I was kind of like, I remember watching it and being like, I never want to get married. That's what anyway, guys, it was a pleasure as always. I had a great time doing this one. It's one of my favorite films of all time. And I think watching it was a great time for Daniel and I too, because with the current work we're doing.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure. So I appreciate you both for being on here, and I can't wait to do the next one.
Yeah, it was awesome.
My name is Donovan Thompson.
I'm Daniel Wingfield.
And I'm Bruce Hutchinson.
And we have spoken.